If you recall, last week I was attempting a Moog special but failed miserably by blowing out a bunch of Mooga power adapters. I also had a flight to New York to catch. I returned from the Big Apple with freshened vigour to attempt take two. It's miserable here, but I do like it. The purpose of this Moog special is to identify where best we can invest our precious cash. The Mooga range is about to be withdrawn. They're going to rise heavily in price. The analog delays are horrifically expensive already on the various different second-hand websites. But also, there's two exciting, relatively new additions to the Moog range, the Mother 32 and the dfam. So are all Moogs created as one? Should we splash the cash on everything while the opportunity is there? Well, let's have a look. So this week I'll be using the MixPre 10 to record the sounds. The jury is out on this box. What I love about the MixPre 3 is its simplicity, and what I feel with this is they've overcomplicated the functionality of this, where actually what you really want to use it for is simplicity. A prime example of that is it doesn't have a record button. It's got this fiddly little toggle here, wobbly little thing, which just aesthetically it's not as pleasing just to hit something into record. But because of the power of SD cards, I've got a 256GB one in there at the moment, I can just let this run the whole session, safe in the knowledge that it's going to capture everything. So we do that on and just fire out a little bit of something. Okay, so let's start with the Mooga. This is my collection: the low pass filter, the analog delay, the cluster flux, which I believe was actually a limited edition, and the ring modulator. These two are new ones that I've bought. This one is actually new out of the box. This is much more second-hand. Unfortunately, this one doesn't work, which is very unusual for Moog products. They tend to be built really, really well, but I just can't get this thing to work, and I have used these things before, so I'm not being thick, I don't think. So this is off the table for today. Now, Mooga, what place do they have on Modular Mondays? They're kind of stomp boxes, they're guitar pedals. What they are is actually they've extracted the technology out of their modular synths and have put them into these stomp boxes. When they came out 20 years ago, it was really revolutionary because suddenly keyboard players started using stomp boxes. They all tend to have trim pots, so you can really adjust the attenuation between the kind of line level synth stuff and the guitar level stuff. What I love about them is they don't sound like guitar pedals, which often have a kind of quite a scoopy mid-range. They're super wide bandwidth with a lot of concentration on the bottom end. They also have control voltage inputs on the back, but I have never used those. So let's start with the ring modulator. I've got a pattern here in the dfam. Let's hit go on that. This is with the ring modulator in bypass. So I'm going for quite a quirky sound today. So let's take this out of bypass. What you can also do is add a carrier signal in as well. To combine sounds interestingly. Love listening to all of this kind of stuff, really kind of driven up. I think the other thing worth mentioning about Moogs is when you drive them, it doesn't sound like a guitar pedal being overdriven. So this is basically a chorus flange pedal with a difference. The levels of the flange and chorus are controlled by LFOs and this kind of delay stage here. I've tapped in a tempo that matches this one. So if we hit bypass, you'll hear the kind of effect that I've got with this. Switch it to flange. Oh, listen to that. Awesome. So the great thing about stuff like this is it's about keeping something like this running so you can find your kind of juicy bars, sample those, loop those, all those kinds of things. So let's just listen to what the pedal's doing. Let's mix it all the way. So we're really driving that. Let's change the time. So that's on short. Now, the thing I'm not so sure about with this is the delay time is very short, as you'd expect from an analog, not digital delay. The drive settings sound great, but it doesn't have a filter state, reproducing all the bottom end of your synth. I imagine this is going to sound great on guitars and maybe a slightly higher synth part. So let's put that into bypass for now and move on to the Mother 32. So you've got your keyboard here. Some noise there. So no doubting that it sounds absolutely super fat, and there's all sorts of kind of patchable stuff here. You can also use MIDI to control these. However, one of the things that really attracted me about it is the sequencer, but I'm sad to report that it is just far from intuitive to use. And the danger of something like this, which isn't a workhorse item, is that you have to relearn it every time you pull it off the shelf. So we're going to have to get one of these. And we know how much we like having to RTFM. Okay, creating a pattern. So it's this kind of combinations of stuff that I find really difficult because it's just not intuitive. So initialize current pattern, we go shift, reset accent, and pattern bank. Now we enter shift keyboard to enter keyboard mode, and then shift run record. Now I started getting frustrated with this the other week, and I held down shift run record, and that's another function, so I couldn't get the sequencer to work at all. Shift, reset, pattern, shift keyboard, shift. And then rest. Stop. So I'll come to a conclusion at the end of this film, but now over to Sandy, who's providing me certainly with a kind of weekly catharsis, watching him piece these things together in such a zen-like manner, a manner of which my patience could never withhold.
Hi Christian, I'm going to jump straight in with another DIY build this week. This week I'm going to be building the DIY Delay by Erica Synths. And you can see me just opening up the box, setting aside the knobs and faceplate and power cable, and then just going through the contents, just making sure that the legs are straight on the IC sockets, and just making sure that everything's there, going through the bill of materials, and just checking that it's all, present and correct. And this looks like a lot of the same capacitors over and over again, but there are actually 3 different kinds with the same appearance, and they just have a different number on them, so I was just organising those as well. Now, I was looking around online for the instructions, and actually I didn't find the instructions for this build until I'd already made a bit of a mistake. So if you're going to build this one, you'll find the assembly instructions not in with all the other assembly stuff, like the schematics and the bill of materials and so on. You'll actually find that in the user manual, which was a novel place to find it. But there we go. So instead of starting with the IC sockets and the low profile things like the diodes, I decided to solder the resistors first. You'll notice that these are standing on end, and this kind of method of soldering through hole resistors can make them take up less space on the board, but it does make them quite fiddly and sort of difficult to place. Also, there's quite a lot of components very close together on the PCB, which makes the silk screen very hard to read. So I was just going off of the schematic before. So what I like to do when I'm soldering a stand-up resistor like that is solder the end that has an exposed cable on the front of the PCB, and then it'll stay in place when you flip it over and solder the other side. And then once you've made sure that everything's soldered in place, I was just actually wicking away a little bit of mistaken solder there, and you can see they sit quite nicely. They don't take up a lot of space. So I skipped ahead a little bit because there's quite a lot of resistors and the process is basically the same, but just looking for them on the schematic and checking that it matches up to the colors, and even getting your voltmeter out and measuring them if you're not sure. So now I went on to what should probably be step one, which was the soldering of all of the through-hole diodes. And you'll notice that these sit flat, so they sit a lot lower profile, meaning that if I was to turn them over, they would kind of flip out and slide out the holes. So what I did again was just soldered them from the other side, at least one leg a little bit, just to keep them in place. And then I did the same for the other diodes and the ferrite beads as well. Once I was done with that, again, just flip it over, tidy up all the soldering and make sure it's all there, and then trim the legs again. Excuse the soldering iron in the way of the camera, it does move in just a second. There we are. After the ferrite beads and the diodes are done, I seated the IC sockets. These were very fiddly, and again, I imagine it probably would have been easier if I hadn't soldered all of the resistors first. But live and learn, it still works. And this last one was especially fiddly. I ended up having to get a multi-tool out just to straighten the legs a little. And then what I do is go around and solder the opposite corners of each of them. And then once I'm happy that they're straight, I'll just solder all the other legs as well. You like to be nice and quick when you're soldering IC sockets because they're made of plastic, and if you hold the soldering iron on there forever, then the socket itself will start to melt. And there's our sockets and our resistors and diodes all in place. Up next is the capacitors. Again, this is a step before the resistors go on, standing on end. These were especially tricky to find, so again, you can see me sort of thinking about it in between each capacitor and looking at the schematic and trying to figure out where to place them. And again, with any of these builds, just like the Hex VCA, we want to just take our time and be methodical, double check you're working as you go, make sure that the resistor you're placing is the correct value or the capacitor is the correct value before you go soldering it. And once I've done all the ceramic capacitors and our voltage regulators, put on our electrolytic capacitors. There's 4 of those. And again, for those, just make sure that the polarity is correct. And now I got a handy magnifying tool. You'll notice I'm using this kind of helping hand and magnifying loop, which has come in very handy for this build. And that's because the transistors and the reference voltage, the voltage regulators, all have the same package. So again, they look very similar. You've got to read the text on them and it's very small. And again, once you've got those, just check the polarity as you're putting them in and just make sure they're seated correctly and that you're not mixing up one for the other. Again, these ones, once you turn the board over, are actually kind of tricky to see sometimes. This last one was very fiddly, but there we are. You can see I got it in there, got it soldered, and trimmed the legs off. So at this point, we're not actually finished placing all of the components. This is what we normally do at the end of a build in most other modules, but we're going to place all of the pots and buttons and sockets and so on. And just make sure, in this case, there's actually there's 3 linear and 1 logarithmic potentiometer on there, so just make sure you get the right one in the right place. And then seat all of the sockets and put the faceplate on. And I was really messing around with this one to make sure that the buttons would be able to travel. That's the main point to check here, I guess, is that the buttons will also release once you press them in. And then I just attach that with the hardware provided and turn it over. Unfortunately, I've gone a bit out of focus here, but all I was doing was soldering the pots and the jacks and the buttons. And again, I'm using that helping hand just to keep things still, which is really handy. I definitely recommend getting one. This is the point in the build where things start to get very tight when you're soldering. So just take your time, be methodical. It's not a race. So this is the MCU board. This is the sort of digital board where all the brains are. That comes pre-programmed and tested. And you can see it's a very, very small surface mount stuff. So basically what you do is solder some headers onto that and then attach the headers and solder them onto the main board. And then we're just taking that off and setting it aside. Whilst we solder on those male headers onto the main board. And one of the last steps here is just to get our LEDs in place. And this is the finished module, which I'll be putting in my case shortly. I've tested and calibrated it already. It's one of the most complicated builds I've done yet, although I did have very good instructions online. One thing to note if you're going to build this is you'll find the assembly instructions not in the bill of materials and everything else, but in the actual user manual for the DIY delay. The reason I say it's probably one of the most complicated builds is because of those stand-up resistors, and things get awfully tight towards the end of the build when you're soldering the legs on the LEDs and just putting things in at the very last stages of the build. It's got fewer components than some of the other builds, like the Hex VCA, for instance, but it's just the tightness of the build and the layout makes it quite difficult, but a very rewarding build. Anyway, back to you, Christian.
So are all Moogs created equal? Well, the thing is, with the Mother 32, unless you're planning to kind of base a workflow around it, and because of its limitations, I think that's doubtful. If you're planning on kind of taking it on the road as the centerpiece of your kind of performance rig, then yeah, it sounds great. It's not really an all-rounder. Yes, it sounds great and you can whack a MIDI keyboard in, but I think there are better offerings out there that do this, even from Moog itself. The problem is that I know, because of its lack of intuitivity, that I will use it and then I'll put it on the shelf. And then I'll want to go back to it in the future, but I will have completely forgotten the combination of buttons you need to do in order to program it. So I will just leave it there, and I fear it will gather dust. The dfam, on the other hand, is just such a brilliantly original piece of kit. It's very inspiring to use, and even if it's, you know, not to create patterns, but to create sounds that you then sample and work into your own MIDI-based arrangements, I do think it's fantastic. I think it's inspiring. I think it's something that I will turn to time and time again. the Moog Fugas are brilliant, rich sounding pedals, and if you can pick any up for a bargain, I do think they're worth it. However, I think spending something in the region of, I believe the analog delay cost me $700. I'm not a mental analogist, and I just believe this is one of those situations where digital is better, digital delays. However, the one possible exception is for guitarists. I think it's such a wonderfully rich sounding delay that will probably give you quite a unique sound. But again, because you can't lock it to anything, I think its kind of applications are limited. And the one thing about Moog is they may be divorceware, they may seem very expensive, but I do believe they always at least hold their value. So well worth it in that respect. Next week, I'm going to be returning to the Franken-synth and plumbing these Moogs into it. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. If you like what Sandy and myself do, please hit like. And if you want to be notified the next time we put a film up, just hit that little bell button. See you next week.